A pinch of pepper was once worth more than its weight in gold. This is the story of the medieval spice routes, the network that forged Europe's first global economy. By the end of our journey, you will understand how the pursuit of flavor built empires and designed the blueprint for our modern world. We will uncover how a quest for cloves and cinnamon led to the discovery of new continents, and why a shipwreck in the Indian Ocean could bankrupt a European king. This tale reveals a hidden truth about how our interconnected world began. What single ingredient do you think could change the course of history? Europe was a land of quiet villages and local lords, a continent looking inward after the great Roman roads had fallen silent. To the east, however, the world was anything but quiet. Vast trading empires thrived, moving silks, gems, and spices along routes that stretched for thousands of miles. For a European noble, a small pouch of pepper was a symbol of immense wealth, something to be locked away with the family silver. The journey these spices took was almost unimaginable. They passed through dozens of hands, from growers in the Molucca Islands to merchants in bustling Indian ports, then across the deserts on Arab caravans, and finally into the warehouses of powerful Italian cities like Venice and Genoa. Each hand that touched them added another layer of cost, another tax, another reason why the price was so astronomically high. This was a world of walls where knowledge of the wider globe was fragmented and controlled. Europe sat at the very edge of this system, a distant consumer with no direct line to the source. That profound disconnect created a pressure that would soon become unstoppable. The hunger for flavor was about to redraw the map of the world itself. So what exactly was a spice? The word itself paints a much richer and more complex picture than we might assume. While pepper and cinnamon were certainly kings of the kitchen, the cargo that traveled these ancient highways was far more diverse. Think of fragrant clouds of frankincense and myrrh smoke rising from church altars, essential for sacred ceremonies. Picture bolts of cloth dyed a deep, impossible blue with indigo, a color so rare it was reserved for royalty. Envision rare gems, exotic feathers, and even strange creatures, all bundled together under the single, powerful label of spices. These were not just flavorings, they were the very building blocks of status and spirituality. In a world without refrigeration, a spice like pepper was also a practical tool for preserving food through long winters, making it a genuine necessity. But its deeper value was symbolic. To possess and display these items was to broadcast your piety, your wealth, and your connection to a distant, almost mythical world. The collective hunger for all of these Eastern luxuries, not just one single plant or resin, created an immense, sustained economic pressure. It was this powerful, multifaceted desire that would ultimately fund the construction of new ships and push explorers toward the edge of the known world, setting the stage for a commercial revolution that connected continents for the very first time. This Venetian monopoly was not built on military conquest alone, but on a web of calculated diplomacy and commercial intelligence. While kings and princes ruled by the sword, the merchants of the lagoon ruled with contracts and ledgers. They secured exclusive agreements with the Mamluk sultans of Egypt, who themselves controlled the final overland leg of the spice route from the Red Sea. In the bustling ports of Alexandria and Beirut, Venetian agents would receive cargoes that had crossed thousands of miles, paying for them not just with silver, but with other coveted European goods like timber, wool, and even slaves captured from the Black Sea region. This entire system was protected by a state-sponsored cartel known as the Collegio, a powerful committee that dictated when the great convoys, the Muda, would sail and precisely how much pepper would be sold upon their return. Can you envision the scene in the markets of Venice when the spice fleet finally arrived? The entire economy of Europe seemed to hold its breath. Prices were not set by open competition, but by this small group of men in a Venetian chamber, their decisions rippling out to affect the cost of a meal in London or Paris. For the rest of Europe, this was an intolerable situation. Every pinch of pepper served at a noble's table was a reminder of their economic servitude, a testament to their reliance on a single, powerful city-state that stood between them and the riches of the East. This deep-seated resentment, this burning need to break free from the Venetian stranglehold, would soon provide the fuel for the most daring voyages of exploration the world had ever seen. The gates of the East were closing. In 1453, the mighty city of Constantinople, a Christian bastion and the final western terminal for the overland spice caravans, fell to the rising Ottoman Empire. For European merchants, this was more than a political shift, it was a commercial catastrophe. The Ottomans now commanded the most critical choke point on the map, and they understood its value perfectly. They imposed crushing new taxes and unpredictable restrictions on the precious goods moving through their territory, squeezing the already strained spice trade to its breaking point. Every sack of pepper that now reached Venice carried an even heavier burden of cost and risk, a burden that was passed directly to the kings and commoners of Europe. The Venetian monopoly, once a source of immense profit, was suddenly revealed as a profound vulnerability. The entire continent was held hostage by a chain of intermediaries, and the final link was now in the hands of a powerful rival. This crisis transformed the search for spices from a matter of luxury into one of urgent necessity. It was no longer enough to dream of new routes, they had to be found. The pressure to escape this economic trap, to find a way around the Ottoman wall, became the driving force behind the great voyages of discovery. Monarchs who had once viewed exploration as a risky speculation now saw it as a strategic imperative for their kingdom's very survival. The race was on to find a path to the Indies that was beyond the reach of any sultan's tax collector, a race that would send ships south into the unknown Atlantic and east into the vastness of the open ocean. While Venice counted its profits, a small kingdom on Europe's Atlantic edge was quietly building its escape route. Portugal, under the visionary guidance of Prince Henry the Navigator, turned its back on the contested Mediterranean and set its sights on the vast, open ocean to the south. This was no series of haphazard voyages, but a deliberate, century-long national project. Its goal was breathtakingly ambitious: to find a sea path around Africa and sail directly to the spice-filled markets of India, bypassing every single middleman. The Portuguese weapon of choice was the caravel, a nimble ship with triangular lateen sails that could tack against the wind, a vessel perfectly designed for exploring unknown coasts. Year after year, these ships inched further down the West African shoreline, a slow unfolding of the world's map driven by relentless determination. Along the way, they established fortified trading posts, securing gold and engaging in the local commerce, including the trade of individuals, a practice that funded their continued journey south. But these outposts were never the true objective. They were merely supply stations on the long road to a far greater prize. This patient, state-funded exploration marked a revolutionary shift in how nations pursued wealth. It was no longer about controlling a single market or route, but about inventing an entirely new one. The success of this Portuguese gambit would prove something profound to every other European power: that the greatest fortunes lay not in fighting over the old world, but in daring to discover a new one. The year 1498 finally delivered the proof Portugal had gambled a century to obtain. After a harrowing journey around the southern tip of Africa, Vasco da Gama's small fleet of Portuguese ships drifted into the bustling port of Calicut on the Malabar coast of India. For the first time, a European vessel had dropped anchor in the heart of the spice world. The local merchants who came to inspect the strange ships and their weary crew were likely unimpressed by the trade goods they offered, simple items like striped cloth and wash basins. But the Portuguese were not there to impress with trinkets. They were there to witness the source of unimaginable wealth with their own eyes. They saw the warehouses overflowing with peppercorns, the air thick with the scent of ginger and cinnamon. When da Gama's fleet returned to Lisbon, its holds were only partially filled, a cautious first sample. Yet that single cargo of pepper and spices was sold for a sum 60 times greater than the entire cost of the expedition. The arithmetic was undeniable, and it echoed through the courts of Europe like a thunderclap. The old system of endless markups and middlemen was now obsolete. Portugal held the key to a direct line to the source, and they moved with ruthless speed to turn this knowledge into an empire. The maps and sailing charts brought back by da Gama became state secrets, the foundation for a new kind of power not built on owning land, but on controlling the sea lanes themselves. The global economy, for so long a web of overland caravans, was being violently and permanently rewired. Wealth would no longer flow through gates held by sultans and merchants, but across oceans commanded by anyone with the courage and the cannons to seize their share. The Carreira da India was the most dangerous and lucrative shipping lane on Earth. To secure its prize, Portugal launched a state-controlled annual fleet, a floating empire that transformed the vast Indian Ocean into a Portuguese highway. These were not simple merchant ships, but massive, floating fortresses called carracks, their holds cavernous enough for tons of pepper and their decks bristling with cannons. Each vessel was a statement of intent, designed to carry unimaginable wealth and to defend it against any rival, from Ottoman corsairs to competing European traders. The journey from Lisbon to the Portuguese capital in Goa and back was a grueling 6-month ordeal each way, a test of human endurance against an unforgiving sea. Sailors faced violent storms that could splinter a ship's timbers and the silent, creeping horror of scurvy, an illness that would slowly weaken a crew far from any hope of fresh food. The risks were immense, but the arithmetic of reward made the gamble irresistible. A single successful voyage could repay its entire cost dozens of times over, filling the royal treasury with pure profit. The Portuguese crown enforced a strict monopoly on the most prized commodities, especially pepper. Royal agents in Goa purchased the spice directly, cutting out the Arab and Indian middlemen who had dominated the trade for centuries. They systematically redirected the flow of wealth, turning the spice streams that once flowed toward the Red Sea and Persian Gulf toward the new ocean route around the Cape of Good Hope. For the first time in history, a European power was not just buying spices, it was controlling them at the source. This command of the entire supply chain, from Asian grove to European market, allowed Lisbon to set the price, shocking the old Venetian markets and flooding Europe with affordable pepper. The very architecture of global trade was being rebuilt, not with palaces and warehouses, but with the deep, rolling hulls of Portuguese carracks. While Portugal pushed east, a rival vision was taking shape in the west. Spain, fresh from its final victory over Muslim rule and newly unified under King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, was eager to claim its own place in the race for spices. They threw their support behind a stubborn Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, who proposed a radical shortcut to the Indies by sailing not around Africa, but directly west across the Atlantic. His plan was built on a critical and fortunate error. Columbus had drastically underestimated the size of the Earth, believing the journey to Asia would be far shorter than it truly was. This miscalculation led his 3 small ships not to the spice-laden shores of the Indies, but to an entirely new continent, a world completely unknown to the maps and merchants of Europe. He searched in vain for the black pepper and cinnamon trees he had promised his royal patrons, finding instead new plants, new peoples, and a landscape that defied all expectation. The direct route to the spices had failed, yet his voyages unlocked something perhaps even more valuable in the long run. Spanish conquistadors soon uncovered mountains of silver, most famously at Potosi in modern Bolivia and in the mines of Mexico. This torrent of New World silver did not itself flavor a single dish in Europe, but it solved a fundamental problem for the spice trade. Asia, particularly China, had a powerful demand for silver, using it as its primary monetary metal. Suddenly, Spain possessed the one commodity that could buy all the spices its ships could carry. The Spanish quest for flavor had accidentally created a global monetary circuit. American silver was shipped to Europe, then carried across the Indian Ocean to Asia, where it was exchanged for pepper, porcelain, and silks, which were then brought back to Europe. The world was no longer a series of separate trading zones, but a single, interconnected economic machine. The search for spice had finally closed the circle of the globe, binding it together with threads of silver and ambition. This collision of empires was now inevitable. With Portugal sailing east and Spain sailing west, their spheres of expansion were destined to crash into one another, creating a diplomatic crisis over who had the right to claim what. To prevent a costly war between the two Catholic powers, they turned to the highest authority they knew, the Pope in Rome. In 1494, he brokered a truly audacious agreement, the Treaty of Tordesillas. Imagine a line drawn down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, hundreds of miles west of the Cape Verde Islands. The Pope's decree granted Spain exclusive rights to all undiscovered lands to the west of that line, which ultimately included the vast continents of the Americas. Portugal received everything to the east, securing its hard-won sea route around Africa and into the spice-rich Indian Ocean. With a single stroke of a pen, the world was divided in two. This was not just a land grab, it was the first formal blueprint for a global economy, one entirely designed and controlled by European powers. The treaty gave Portugal a legally sanctioned monopoly on the ocean path to the pepper and cinnamon of the East, while Spain was formally confined to the Americas, a region initially disappointing for its lack of traditional spices. This division, however, would have a profound and unintended consequence. It forced Spain to double down on exploring its own half of the globe, leading to the eventual discovery of those massive silver mines. So while Portugal directly controlled the spice trade, Spain accidentally unlocked the financial key that would power it for centuries, creating two complementary, yet fiercely competing, halves of a single worldwide system. The race was no longer just about finding treasure, but about controlling the very rules of the game itself. Yet the true heart of the spice world pulsed even further to the east, in a scattered chain of volcanic islands shrouded in mist and legend. The Moluccas, known to Europeans as the Spice Islands, were the sole origin of spices that made pepper seem almost common. A single tree, the clove, grew nowhere else on Earth. The nutmeg tree, with its twin treasures of the nutmeg seed itself and the crimson lace of mace that surrounded it, was also a prisoner of this unique geography. To control these islands was to hold a natural monopoly granted by nature itself, a secret garden of unimaginable value. When Portuguese ships finally fought their way into these waters, they found a world far more complex than they had anticipated. They were not entering an empty land waiting for a flag, but a sophisticated and competitive trading network dominated by powerful Muslim sultanates like Ternate and Tidor. Chinese junks and Arab dhows were already familiar visitors in these ports, their captains skilled in the delicate diplomacy required to secure a few sacks of these precious goods. The Portuguese established a few fortified outposts, but their hold was always tenuous, a constant struggle against local resistance, rival traders, and the sheer logistical nightmare of operating so far from home. This relentless drive for cloves and nutmeg did more than just fill treasure ships. It forcibly entangled Europe into the ancient and intricate political webs of Southeast Asia. The pursuit of flavor was no longer just a maritime adventure. It had become a delicate and often violent game of global diplomacy. The scent of cloves and nutmeg carried on the sea breeze was an irresistible call to new challengers. As the 16th century drew to a close, a small but fiercely determined nation entered the global arena, the Dutch Republic. They were in the midst of a grueling 80-year war for independence from Spain, and they saw the spice trade not just as a source of profit, but as a weapon. If they could cripple the Iberian monopoly, they could strike a direct blow against their Spanish overlords and fund their own fight for freedom. Dutch merchants, unable to challenge the power of kings directly, devised a revolutionary new tool for wealth and war. They pooled the capital of thousands of ordinary citizens into joint stock companies, creating a financial engine of unprecedented power. This was the birth of a new kind of corporation, one that could raise fleets and raise armies, all funded by public investment and driven by a single-minded pursuit of profit. Their first ships to the Indies returned with cargoes that sent shockwaves through the markets of Amsterdam, proving that the Portuguese grip could be broken. The Dutch approach was brutally efficient. They did not seek to merely trade with local rulers as the Portuguese had often done. Their goal was total control. They deployed faster, more heavily armed ships and used their superior financial organization to buy spices in massive quantities, deliberately undercutting their rivals to drive them out of the market. Then they moved to seize the source itself, capturing key Portuguese forts and trading posts from West Africa to the Straits of Malacca. This was a more systematic, more ruthless form of colonialism, one where the ledger book was as important as the canon. The world watched as a nation of merchants transformed itself into a global empire, proving that commercial competition had become the primary force shaping the destinies of nations. The spice race was no longer a simple rivalry. It was a complex, multi-sided war for the very heart of the global economy. This new corporate entity was unlike anything the world had seen. In 1602, the Dutch Republic merged its competing trading companies into a single, colossal organization, the Dutch East India Company, known by its initials VOC. It was not merely a company, it was a sovereign power in its own right. The government granted it an exclusive charter, a legal monopoly over all Dutch trade from the southern tip of Africa all the way to the Strait of Magellan. More astonishingly, this charter gave the VOC the authority to build forts, maintain armies, sign binding treaties with foreign rulers, and even wage war. A private corporation now held the power of a nation-state, its cannons and its contracts funded by an entirely new invention, the modern stock market. For the first time in history, any citizen with some spare capital could buy a share of the company, spreading the immense risk and potential reward of these dangerous voyages across thousands of investors instead of a handful of wealthy merchants. This financial revolution provided the VOC with a war chest that dwarfed the treasuries of most kingdoms, a torrent of capital that could fund dozens of warships and thousands of soldiers for a single, brutal purpose: to seize the spice trade at its source and choke off all competition. The age of the explorer was over, and the age of the corporate executive had begun. This fusion of finance, firepower, and a single-minded focus on profit would reshape the world map with a cold, calculating efficiency that kings and conquerors had never possessed. How could a simple board of directors meeting in an Amsterdam office command more power on the other side of the world than an emperor? The answer lay in their relentless pursuit of a single, devastatingly effective strategy: total monopoly. This ruthless corporate logic reached its most chilling conclusion on a handful of tiny, verdant islands. The Banda Archipelago was the only place on the entire planet where the nutmeg tree grew naturally, a botanical fluke that made its soil more valuable than gold. For the Dutch East India Company, this natural monopoly was an unacceptable risk. To control the global price of nutmeg, they needed to control not just the trade, but the very earth itself. Their strategy was one of total domination. Company soldiers moved through the islands, and the local communities faced unimaginable hardship. Many individuals were lost to conflict, while others were forced into labor. The VOC then systematically altered the landscape itself, sending out teams to cut down every nutmeg tree on islands not under their direct command. They transformed entire ecosystems into economic weapons, ensuring that the precious spice could only be harvested from a few company-owned plantations. To enforce this artificial scarcity, the VOC's warships patrolled the surrounding waters like sea-bound guards. Any vessel found carrying nutmeg without the company's permission was seized and sunk. The penalty for smuggling a single nutmeg seed or even a seedling was execution. This was not merely trade, it was a form of ecological and economic warfare waged by a corporation. The immense wealth that flowed back to Amsterdam was built on a foundation of profound loss and deliberate scarcity. It reveals a difficult truth about the birth of our global system, where the drive for market share could justify the reshaping of human lives and the natural world itself. What does it mean when a company can hold the power of life and death over a distant land, all in the name of controlling the flavor of a pie? England would not surrender the spice race without a fight. Just 2 years before the Dutch formed their mighty VOC, Queen Elizabeth I granted a charter to a group of London merchants, creating the English East India Company. This new corporation was given an exclusive monopoly on all English trade with the lands east of the Cape of Good Hope. The English arrived in the Spice Islands with ambition, but they found the Dutch already entrenched and utterly ruthless. The competition turned bloody, culminating in a tragic event known as the Amboina Massacre, where English traders faced severe consequences after being accused of conspiring against the Dutch. This violent confrontation was a brutal lesson in realpolitik. The English East India Company simply could not match the financial and military power of the Dutch in their own backyard. Defeat in the Spice Wars forced a profound strategic pivot. If England could not dominate the trade in cloves and nutmeg, it would have to find another path to wealth in the East. Their gaze turned westward to the vast and complex shores of the Indian subcontinent. There, they began establishing humble trading posts, initially focused not on spices, but on the brilliant blue dye of indigo, the fine woven cotton cloth known as calico, and saltpeter, a vital component for making gunpowder. This shift in focus was one of the great unintended consequences of the spice trade. Blocked from the islands of Indonesia, the English were funneled into India, where they would slowly build a commercial presence that would, over centuries, evolve into one of history's most powerful territorial empires. The British Raj, which would one day rule millions of people, began not with a quest for cinnamon, but with a cargo hold full of cloth and a desperate need to find a market the Dutch had not yet locked down. This torrent of spice wealth could not be contained in simple treasure chests. It demanded entirely new machines for managing money on an unprecedented scale. The great port cities of Northern Europe, first Antwerp and then Amsterdam and London, transformed into the world's first true financial capitals. Their harbors were crowded with ships, but their centers now buzzed with a new kind of activity, the trade not in goods but in promises and risk. Can you picture the scene? Merchants no longer gathered just to buy pepper, but to buy and sell pieces of paper that represented a ship still at sea, or a share in a future company's profits. This was the birth of the modern stock exchange, a marketplace for ambition where capital could flow as freely as the tides. The staggering risks of these long voyages, where a single storm could wipe out a merchant's entire fortune, gave rise to a brilliant financial innovation, marine insurance. For a premium, a merchant could now protect his investment, spreading the potential loss of one shipwreck across many other policyholders. This single idea, the ability to hedge a bet against the fury of nature, made global trade a calculable risk rather than a pure gamble. The joint stock companies themselves were the ultimate expression of this new financial logic. When you purchased a share in the Dutch East India Company, you were not just buying a piece of a ship, you were buying a fractional stake in an entire empire, complete with its armies, its forts, and its future conquests. This created the world's first class of passive investors, ordinary citizens whose personal wealth rose and fell with news from distant shores, fueling a culture of speculation and market frenzy that feels remarkably familiar to us today. The entire sophisticated toolkit of capitalism, from corporate ownership and stock markets to insurance and commercial banking, was essentially forged in the white-hot furnace of the spice trade. The need to move, store, and multiply the profits from pepper and cloves built the very financial engine that would power Europe's rise for the next 3 centuries. The relentless pursuit of spice had unlocked a biological revolution far greater than any merchant's ledger. A silent, unintended exchange was now underway, a global transfer of plants, animals, and even illness that historians would later call the Columbian Exchange. While galleons carried silver to Asia and spices back to Europe, their ballast and cargo holds teemed with stowaways that would permanently reshape the planet. The Old World and the New World, separated for millennia, were suddenly and violently reintroduced. European ships carried across the ocean not just their ambitions, but also the seeds of wheat and sugarcane, the saplings of apple and orange trees, and livestock like horses, cattle, and pigs. These were the building blocks of familiar European life, transplanted onto an alien continent. But the most transformative cargo traveled in the opposite direction. American plants like the potato, tomato, and maize began their slow, steady conquest of the Eastern Hemisphere. Can you envision Italian cuisine without the tomato, or Irish history without the potato? These humble crops, once unknown outside the Americas, would soon fuel unprecedented population booms across Europe and Asia, their caloric abundance supporting larger families and larger cities. Yet this exchange was tragically lopsided. The same ships that brought new foods also carried Old World illnesses, against which the indigenous populations of the Americas had no natural defenses. Communities faced devastating health challenges that reshaped their societies and led to profound cultural loss. This was the dark, unplanned cost of connection. The search for flavor had done more than reroute trade. It had scrambled the very biological foundations of the world, creating new agricultural landscapes and altering the course of human history in ways no spice merchant could have ever predicted. The taste of a distant continent was slowly finding its way into the kitchens of bakers and shopkeepers. As Portuguese carracks and Dutch flights flooded European ports with pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, the once impossible prices began a steady, historic decline. The spice cabinet, once a nobleman's locked chest, was becoming a merchant's shelf. This was a quiet revolution measured in pinches and drams. Cookbooks published for the growing urban middle class began to instruct housewives to use spices not as rare jewels to be displayed, but as ingredients to be enjoyed, recommending generous amounts of pepper in a sausage or nutmeg in a pie. This new, widespread demand created a powerful economic engine. Every additional household seeking a small pouch of pepper for its Sunday meal justified the financing of another risky voyage to the Moluccas. Those successful voyages, in turn, brought back even larger cargoes which pushed prices down further, inviting yet more people to participate in the market. It was a virtuous cycle of consumption and supply that wove the global economy ever tighter. A similar and even more powerful story was unfolding with sugar. This other Eastern luxury, once a rare medicinal powder, was now being cultivated on a massive scale by enslaved Africans on Atlantic islands and later in the Americas. The brutal production system created a torrent of supply, transforming sugar from a spice for the rich into a staple for the masses, fueling its own immense demand. This was the true birth of modern consumer society. For the first time, the collective desires of ordinary people for flavor, sweetness, and a touch of status in their daily lives were not just a consequence of trade, but the very force that propelled it, directing the course of ships and shaping the destinies of nations across the globe. The Mediterranean Sea, for centuries the very heart of European commerce, was beginning to feel like a quiet backwater. The great galleys of Venice and Genoa, which had once carried the wealth of the world, now found their most precious cargoes dwindling to a trickle. The new treasures of the age were no longer arriving on overland caravans, but in the deep holds of ships that had weathered the open Atlantic. This was more than a change in shipping routes, it was a fundamental reordering of the world. The economic energy of Europe, once concentrated in its sunny southern ports, was now being pulled relentlessly toward its cold, grey western shores. The future was being written not in the palaces of Venetian doges, but on the bustling docks of Lisbon, where sailors unloaded pepper directly from India, and in the counting houses of Amsterdam, where merchants bet fortunes on ships that were still months from returning. The Italian city-states, masters of the old world, watched as their power and influence slowly ebbed away, their intricate networks of land-based trade rendered almost obsolete by the sheer efficiency of the ocean highway. What did it matter to control a desert caravan if a single Portuguese carrack could carry more pepper than 1,000 camels? The source of wealth had moved, and with it, the center of the world. This Atlantic shift created a new kind of power, one built on naval architecture, celestial navigation, and the financial machinery to fund voyages that lasted for years. The nations that faced the ocean were suddenly front row to the greatest economic opportunity in human history. Their harbors became funnels for the entire globe's commerce, where sugar from Brazil, silver from Peru, spices from the Moluccas, and silks from China all converged. This constant influx of goods and the immense profits they generated required new institutions, giving rise to the first modern banks, insurance markets, and stock exchanges. The lesson was stark and unforgiving. Mastery of the sea was now infinitely more valuable than control of any single piece of land. A kingdom could be landlocked and powerful, but it could no longer be truly rich. This simple, brutal geographic truth, born from the quest for spice, would dictate the rise and fall of empires for centuries to come, setting the stage for the British Royal Navy's dominance and the eventual creation of a world connected not by roads but by sea lanes. The blueprint for monopoly had been perfected in the spice groves of the East, and it was now copied onto a much larger, more brutal scale. European powers began clearing vast tracts of land in the Americas and the Caribbean, not to search for existing treasures, but to manufacture them. These were the plantation economies, massive agricultural factories dedicated to a single purpose: feeding the world's new appetite for sugar, tobacco, coffee, and cotton. The same financial machinery that funded a voyage for pepper now funded the purchase of land, the construction of mills, and the acquisition of the human labor required to make it all function. The entire brutal system was powered by the transatlantic movement of individuals, a tragic chapter where millions of people were forcibly taken from their homes in Africa and transported across the ocean under conditions of immense hardship. This created a grim triangular trade. European manufactured goods were shipped to Africa, where they were exchanged for human lives. Those individuals were then carried across the Atlantic to work the plantations, and the sugar and tobacco they produced were shipped back to Europe for consumption and further profit. The logistical networks, the insurance schemes, and the corporate structures first invented to manage the risk of a spice voyage were now applied to managing the systematic production of these new consumer goods. The pursuit of flavor had inadvertently designed the engine for a much wider colonial economy, one that ran on exploitation and reshaped the demographics of two continents. This was the dark legacy of the spice routes, a model of distant control and mass production that would define global economics for centuries to come. A ship's captain in the middle of the vast, empty ocean had one terrifying question to answer. Where am I? The immense profits of the spice trade depended entirely on solving this fundamental riddle of navigation. A single miscalculation could send a vessel loaded with treasure hundreds of miles off course, dooming its crew and bankrupting its investors. This terrifying uncertainty, more than any abstract curiosity, became the engine for a scientific revolution. The pursuit of pepper and cloves demanded a new understanding of the planet itself. European monarchs and merchant companies began offering huge cash prizes for anyone who could invent a reliable method for calculating a ship's position at sea. The magnetic compass, a Chinese invention refined by Arab sailors, became a standard fixture on European vessels, providing a constant, if sometimes shaky, reference to north. But the compass alone was not enough. Navigators needed to know their latitude, their distance north or south of the equator. For this, they turned to the stars, using instruments like the astrolabe and later the cross staff to measure the angle of the sun or the North Star above the horizon. These tools transformed the sky into a cosmic clock and ruler, allowing a skilled sailor to pinpoint his location on the globe with surprising accuracy. Yet the most vexing problem remained unsolved for centuries, the puzzle of longitude. How could a captain know how far east or west he had traveled? Without this knowledge, the vast Pacific Ocean was a watery prison of guesswork. The solution finally arrived with the marine chronometer, a clock so precise it could keep time on a rolling ship for months on end. By comparing the local time, determined by the sun, with the time at a home port, a navigator could calculate his longitude. This was not just a technical achievement, it was the key that unlocked the final, safe passage across the world's greatest oceans. The quest for commercial advantage had, almost as a byproduct, forced humanity to master the measurement of the earth and the heavens. The same merchants who funded wars for nutmeg groves were also unknowingly funding the birth of modern science, proving that the hunger for flavor could expand the very frontiers of human knowledge. Yet the most profound cargo carried in a ship's hold was not something that could be weighed or taxed. Alongside the sacks of pepper and the chests of silver, the spice routes carried something far more transformative: ideas. These maritime highways became conduits for the invisible exchange of art, religion, and entire systems of knowledge. When Portuguese sailors finally reached the shores of India, they did not discover a primitive land, but a civilization whose sophistication in mathematics and astronomy often surpassed their own. Arab and Indian navigators had been using celestial navigation techniques for centuries. their charts detailing monsoon patterns and star paths that were completely unknown to European pilots. The numerals we use today, including the revolutionary concept of zero, traveled from India through the Islamic world and into European ports, carried by merchants who needed a better way to calculate their profits. This was not a one-way street of enlightenment, but a messy, often reluctant process of cultural borrowing. European shipwrights in Goa studied the design of sturdy Indian and Arabian dhows, incorporating their strengths into the carracks that would come to dominate the oceans. Medical knowledge expanded as well, with European physicians learning about tropical illnesses and their treatments from local healers, and encountering medicinal plants and practices previously unknown to them. This cross-cultural contact, forged in the crucible of commerce, slowly chipped away at Europe's intellectual isolation. The very act of seeking flavor forced a confrontation with the fact that the world was far larger, far older, and far more complex than their old maps had ever suggested. How could your understanding of the universe remain the same when you met astronomers who could predict eclipses with greater accuracy, or merchants who used a decimal system that made complex arithmetic simple? This constant, humbling encounter with advanced knowledge was the quiet undercurrent of the age of exploration, a current that would soon feed into the great intellectual rivers of the Renaissance. The pursuit of profit had unexpectedly opened a pipeline for wisdom, proving that commerce and culture could never be truly separated. The ground beneath European society was beginning to shift in a way no one could immediately see. A slow but relentless tide of silver was washing ashore from Spanish galleons, joining the flood of spices arriving from the east. All this new money, however, did not make everyone richer. Instead, it triggered a century-long wave of inflation that historians call the price revolution. The principle was simple, yet its effects were revolutionary. There was suddenly far more silver coins circulating, but the amount of goods available to buy, from bread to clothes, could not keep up with this new demand. The result was that prices for nearly everything began a long, steady climb. A loaf of bread that cost 1 coin in 1500 might cost 5 of the same coins by 1600. This invisible force reshaped the continent's entire social order. For the old nobility, whose wealth was tied to fixed rents from their land, this was a catastrophe. Their annual income bought less and less with each passing year, silently eroding their power and prestige. But for the merchant in Amsterdam or the commercial farmer in England, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. They could raise the prices for their spices or their wool, their profits swelling as the value of money itself shrank. A new world was being born in the bustling marketplace, one where fluid capital and entrepreneurial spirit were suddenly more valuable than ancient titles and inherited acres of soil. This economic upheaval struck a final, decisive blow against the already weakening foundations of feudalism. The global river of silver and spice had not just created new fortunes, it had dissolved the very glue holding the old economic world together, clearing the way for the modern capitalist system that would dominate the centuries to come. A London spice merchant in 1610 lived in a world his grandfather could never have comprehended. The price he paid for a sack of pepper was no longer set by a Venetian cartel, but by the success of a Dutch naval blockade in the Java Sea, or by a failed monsoon season in the distant Malabar coast. A single event on the far side of the globe could now ripple through his ledger book, determining his profit or his ruin. This was the birth of a new and permanent reality: global interdependence. The world economy was no longer a collection of regional markets, but a single, interconnected machine. Its gears turned in Peruvian silver mines, its belts were the sails of East Indiamen, and its final product was the affordable pepper on a European family's table. This system forged a new and lasting geography of power. Europe positioned itself as the economic core, a hub that drew in raw materials from the global periphery, from the spice islands of Asia to the silver mountains of the Americas. These raw treasures were then transformed, either through simple repackaging or through manufacturing, into more valuable finished goods, which could be sold back to the very regions that supplied the raw materials, often at a significant markup. This core and periphery relationship, established by the relentless logic of the spice trade, established a pattern of economic inequality that would define global interactions for centuries to come. The framework for our modern, globalized world, with its complex supply chains and its distant yet deeply felt economic shocks, was not invented in a boardroom. It was built piece by piece in the holds of the ships that carried cinnamon and cloves. A secret garden could not remain secret forever. By the 18th century, the very strategy that had built the Dutch Empire began to sow the seeds of its own destruction. The astronomical profits from nutmeg and cloves depended entirely on their scarcity, a scarcity the VOC enforced with warships and ruthless pruning of trees. Yet nature, in the end, proved impossible to fully police. French and British agents, posing as botanists or simple traders, managed the ultimate industrial espionage. They successfully smuggled live clove and nutmeg seedlings out of the heavily guarded East Indies, carefully nurturing the precious contraband on the long sea voyage. Once in their own tropical colonies, these stolen plants became the foundation for a new economic reality. The French established vast clove plantations on islands like Zanzibar off the coast of Africa, while the British transplanted nutmeg to the Caribbean island of Grenada. The Dutch monopoly, a fortress built over a century, was breached not by a fleet but by a flower pot. What was the value of controlling a single archipelago when the same trees now grew under a dozen different flags? The magic of monopoly was broken. As these new plantations began to produce, the global supply of spices swelled, and their market price began a long, inevitable slide. Pepper, once counted out peppercorn by peppercorn, was now sold by the sack. The spice cabinet, a status symbol for centuries, became a commonplace feature in ordinary homes. This very success contained a profound irony. The global system the spice trade had built, with its worldwide shipping lanes and colonial outposts, was now so efficient that it could distribute the seeds of its own demise. The age when a king's fortune could hinge on the cargo of a single ship from the Moluccas was fading into history. The economic baton was passing to new commodities that could still command the aura of exclusivity and immense profit. The British East India Company, once defeated in the spice wars, now found its incredible wealth not in pepper, but in tea from China, coffee from Arabia, and later, the controversial trade in opium. These were the new luxuries that would fuel the next chapter of empire, their consumption habits woven into the daily rituals of millions. The spice routes had not vanished, but their golden cargo was now just another item on a much longer manifest, one of many threads in the intricate web they had first spun. The object of desire had changed, but the relentless engine of global commerce, forged by the pursuit of flavor, was only just beginning to accelerate. The quest for spices was the great catalyst, setting in motion forces that would bind the world into a single economic unit for the very first time. This relentless pursuit did more than fill royal treasuries. It motivated the construction of ocean-going ships capable of circling the globe, leading navigators to stumble upon continents that were not on any of their maps. It spurred a scientific race to master the stars and the seas, giving us the tools to measure our planet with new precision. And it forged a revolutionary new entity, the multinational corporation, which could wield more power abroad than many nations. The balance of power in Europe tilted decisively as kingdoms facing the Atlantic rose to prominence while the Mediterranean powers of the Old World slowly faded. This unprecedented flow of wealth and goods demanded new systems to manage it, financing the rise of modern banks, stock markets, and insurance houses that tamed the immense risks of global trade. The world became permanently interconnected, a web of exchange that has never since been broken. We live with the legacy of those first spice routes every single day. The rhythm of global shipping containers moving across the oceans, the complex dance of international finance, even the simple act of reaching for pepper in your kitchen cupboard, all are echoes of that initial, world-altering search for flavor. It stands as a powerful reminder that the pursuit of seemingly simple human desires can ripple through centuries, reshaping geography, society, and the very structure of our shared existence. If you found this journey through the origins of our global economy fascinating, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the hidden forces that shaped our modern world. We would love to hear your thoughts on this pivotal era in the comments below.